Hi everyone, I want to spend a little bit of time to tell you about newborn states and behaviors because we won't have time to go over these in class before your exam, and so I wanted to highlight some things that are important for you to know. So first of all, a state of behavior, a newborn state of behavior, is an organized pattern of physical and physiological responding related to level of central nervous system activation and arousal. So every state of behavior has some observable physical attributes that we'll talk about that correspond to some physiological responses, underlying physiological responses that we'll also talk about. We mentioned during our prenatal unit that state patterns emerge first during prenatal development, meaning that infants start to cycle in and out of states of sleep and wakefulness during prenatal development. States allow an infant to control how much and what kind of input they receive from their environments. What this means is that in different states, infants are more ready to respond and receive stimulation from their environment. So as a caregiver, it's important to know what state an infant is in order to know how you should expect them to respond or not respond to their environment. So the first thing we're going to talk about are sleep states. As you know, infants spend a lot of time in sleep, about 16 to 17 hours, which is not continuous. I apologize for the sound effects. You can't turn the sound off on this or you won't be able to hear me. So bear with me through the sound effects of this slideshow. So there's two different types of sleep states that we're going to talk about. The first is quiet sleep or non-REM sleep. This is non-dreaming sleep. This is where an infant's behavior is pretty motionless. They have regular breathing. Their eyes are closed tightly and consistently, and there's little to no movement during this type of sleep. Infants spend about 28% of the day in quiet sleep. And this type of sleep is associated with growing. So when an infant is in this deep, quiet sleep, they're growing. Their cells are undergoing mitosis, growth hormone is released, and they grow. Contrast that with active sleep. This is the more dreamlike sleep. Active sleep is the type of sleep that usually precedes waking, and they're more responsive to environmental stimulation during active sleep than they are during quiet sleep. So it's easier to wake an infant from active sleep than it is to wake them from quiet sleep. Infants during active sleep, it's not uncommon for them to move around, to make vocalizations. There might be spontaneous startles or even kind of spontaneous body movements as an infant is in active sleep. So a caregiver who doesn't realize that this is a normal part of active sleep might think that an infant is waking up, might think that the infant is fussing or needing a feeding during this time, when really these are all very typical behaviors of active sleep. The next state we'll talk about is what's known as a transitional state. Drowsiness is when infants kind of open and close their eyes. They're transitioning either from sleep to wakefulness or from wakefulness to sleep, or they may transition from sleep to drowsiness and then back to sleep again if they determine there's nothing really worth waking up for. About 4.4% of the day is spent in this transitional drowsy state. Now let's talk about some waking states. Like there's different behaviors that characterize sleeping states, there are different behaviors that characterize waking states. The first waking state is quiet alert. Now, in quiet alert, an infant is typically still with their eyes open, and they are very responsive to environmental stimulation. They're scanning their environment, their body is still, their breathing is a little bit more rapid than during sleep, and they tend to feed the most easily during quiet alert. In quiet alert, they are so responsive to things in the environment. So if you put music on, they'll listen intently to it. If you get in their face and talk to them, they'll watch closely and pay close attention. And because they're responding to environmental stimulation, that's the reason they feed so easily during this state, is because they are responsive to that tactile stimulation from the bottle, and also responsive to their hunger cues. Babies only spend about 2 hours a day in quiet alert, and because that is such a short amount of time, caregivers should really take advantage of the 2 hours that babies are spending in quiet alert. Now, it's not going to be a consistent 2 hours, but this is a time when babies can learn from and respond to their environment, and so caregivers should stimulate the babies appropriately during this 2 hours a day. Now, there's two different types of responses that are common during quiet alert. The first is an orienting response, which is a heightened alertness that includes behavioral localization towards a stimulus. What that means is that if there is a noise or a light or some sort of stimulation that a baby can detect and respond to, then they will look towards or move their ear in the direction of the stimulus, so that they can process it better. Now, contrast that with another type of response that is typical during quiet alert, which is a defensive reaction. Now, a defensive reaction is behavior that involves withdrawal from the source of stimulation. So if the stimulation is too intense, and the baby can't process it all or take it all in, then they'll withdraw from it. So a loud noise they'll turn away from, or a bright light they'll squint their eyes to, as a way of kind of defending their senses against that intense stimulation. The other waking state I want to talk to you about is active alert. Now, active alert, in contrast to quiet alert, is what you would think, that a baby is more active during active alert. They're awake with their body and limb movement, so you'll see lots of leg movement, arm movement, even twisting and turning. During this phase, the infant is motivated by internal stimulation, meaning the sensation of their body. So they might kick their legs, and they like how that sensation feels, so they'll keep kicking their legs. So they're responding to that sensation of their body. They're not responding as much to external stimulation. So if you try and get in their face and talk to them, or turn on some music, or try and get them to look at something during this time, it's not going to be as effective, because they are more responsive to the sensation of their body. So to interact with them effectively during active alert, you can do things to enhance those sensations, like move their legs for them, kick their legs back and forth, tickle their tummies, things that will enhance sensations, because that's what they're motivated by in this state of active alert. Now, another waking state that we're all familiar with is the crying state, which is also a waking state. It's characterized by elevated activity and respiration, distressed facial expressions, and obviously the vocalization of a cry. Infants spend about 3 to 4% of the day crying. That's about an hour, and that is an average. And that average varies across days in babies, meaning some babies might have a much higher average than 1 hour a day. I know my nieces and nephews typically cried much more than that. And even babies that have an average of about an hour a day, they may have some days where they cry a lot more than that and some days where they don't. Differences in infants crying are typical across infants, and they're linked to individual differences in temperament. So biological differences that we all come with are evident in at least one way to see these differences is evidence in differences in cries. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we talk about temperament.